Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 495, This Just In. At 9:30 a.m. on March 22nd, 1925, for the very first time in Japanese history, a brand new technology was trialed. From a broadcast station in Shibaura at the library of the state-run school Tokyo Koto Koge Gakko, the Tokyo Higher Polytechnical School, which is now a part of Chiba University, words rang out on the airwaves for the very first time. Supposedly the very first broadcast in Japanese history was kikoemasu ka, which is roughly, hey, can you hear me? One assumes there had been grander plans in place for what to say during such a historic occasion, but hey, you play the hand you're dealt, right? Regardless of the content, the nature of the broadcast, from the Tokyo Hosokyoku or Tokyo Broadcasting Station, was historic enough in its own right, both for the technological frontier being crossed and because of the speed with which the new technology had been adopted. Radio as an idea had moved pretty quickly from the realm of the theoretical into practicality. In the late 1880s, the German inventor Heinrich Rudolf Hertz had first discovered what were called Hertzian waves at the time. Radio waves as terminology would take a few more decades to catch on, and had demonstrated how to transmit said waves from one place to another. By the late 1890s, there was already active speculation that these waves could be used to create a type of wireless telegraph, and in 1901, the Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi was the first to successfully transmit a message over radio, from Cornwall in England to Newfoundland in Canada. Commercial radio would take a while to emerge. The first applications for the new technology were for shipping as well as military use. The Netherlands was the first country with a regular radio station set up in 1919. In August of 1920, the first American radio station set up by the Detroit News began broadcasting. And of course, 5 years later, Japan had its own very first radio station. And that's pretty swift compared to phones, telegraphs, and even the phonograph, all of which took decades to become commercially viable in Japan once they were established elsewhere. But then again, Japan was already in a very different place in the 1920s than it had been even just a few decades earlier. For one thing, Japan in 1925 was far more industrialized and commercialized than it was at the start of the 20th century. World War I in particular had been huge for Japan's economy. Like the United States, Japan took very few losses in the conflict and did great out of selling supplies to its allies. The money this brought in radically revamped the Japanese economy. Economic growth also helped push along Japan's urbanization, particularly important given the limited range of early radio broadcasts. Finally, radio had one big advantage in Japan by 1925, the standardization of language. By that point, schooling had been compulsory for over half a century, and part of that schooling was the introduction of standard Japanese based on Tokyo dialect, rather than whatever the local dialect happened to be, which meant that you could understand radio broadcasts from other parts of the country, and that material could be syndicated from one station to another without it being incomprehensible to the locals. All of that helps explain, I think, why radio found an audience so quickly in Japan. But in part, of course, it also found an audience because there were powerful interest groups interested in finding it one. The Teishin-sho, or Communication Ministry, was one such group. Its bureaucrats saw the potential of the new medium for helping to control the national conversation along lines that fit the government's own desires. They were joined by some of the most powerful existing media forces in the country, the newspaper companies behind major dailies like Mainichi Shimbun and Asahi Shimbun, both of which saw radio as an extension of their existing media power and, of course, as a way to do something central to their business: sell more ads. Indeed, in a certain sense, the history of radio and all entertainment media is the history of ad sales, with some entertainment designed to get you to listen to the ads attached, which I guess is a natural place to plug the ad-free feed on Patreon now, isn't it? Thing was, while the communication ministry and these private businesses had a shared concern, getting people to tune in, They also had very different ideas about where things should go from there. For example, by 1923, when it was clear commercial radio was coming to Japan, the Communication Ministry set up regulations for applying for a broadcasting license. The hope for Communications Minister Fujimura Yoshiro was to pick one major broadcaster per city, starting with the three largest cities by population. Tokyo, of course, followed by Osaka and Nagoya. However, over 100 different groups applied for broadcasting licenses in each of those three cities. And this actually ended up delaying the whole process substantially. Fujimura wanted one broadcaster per city to make it easier to supervise and monitor what was being broadcast. These companies all wanted a chance to broadcast on their own. Fujimura's compromise was to propose that the most prominent license applicants share control of the broadcast in their cities, essentially setting up a joint venture between them. That went over okay in Tokyo and Nagoya, but in Osaka, the parties involved really did not get along and apparently couldn't work out a deal. And so the whole licensing process ground to a halt for almost 2 years until late 1924 as a result. Still, things did go forward, making Japan something of a rarity. Alongside the United States, it's one of very few countries where the earliest radio stations were controlled privately rather than being government ventures. But the Communication Ministry never really liked that arrangement. It was always worried about the power of radio to influence the national conversation, and about the idea that private entities could have control of that power. Even with government oversight, these autocratic bureaucrats were not happy about the limits on their power the arrangement represented. Not to mention handing over something as important as radio to private entities which were in it for the crass objective of making money. And so the jostling for power continued. In late 1924, just a few months ahead of that first radio broadcast, the ministry forced through a regulation requiring radio broadcasters to be non-profit entities, leading to many of the previously interested private entities dropping out. The Tokyo Hosokyoku, station call sign JOAK, responsible for that very first broadcast, was set up in November 1924. Nagoya's broadcast station, call sign JOCK, set up shop in January 1925, Osaka's JOBK in February. But even here, concerns about limits on their authority led bureaucrats of the Communication Ministry to push for even more power. Specifically, by the autumn of 1925, the new communication minister, Inukai Tsuyoshi, future prime minister and assassination victim for his plans to push back against the military, floated the idea of forcibly incorporating these three different non-profit local stations into a single national agency. Supposedly, he was the one who suggested the name Nippon Hosokai, or Japan Broadcasting Agency, for short, NHK. This was not without controversy, to put it mildly. The stations agreed to the idea in principle, but were hesitant about how much control over their broadcast would end up in government hands, and particularly about a mandate to replace all their executives with Communication Ministry bureaucrats. When the final vote on consolidation among the stations was taken, it narrowly passed. Riot police were actually on hand in case the debate got too heated, though that ended up not being necessary. On August 20th, 1926, JOAK, JOCK, and JOBK were all consolidated under NHK, and radio became a truly national form of mass communication. Indeed, the first national radio story was a very important one for the central government, the illness and death of the Taisho Emperor. Looking back on NHK coverage, things come off as frankly kind of ghoulish. The broadcast updates almost hourly described the health of a dying man in clinical and kind of invasive terms. Updates were given on his blood pressure, body temperature, and circulation, things that seem more appropriate for a clinical study than the description of one man's final hours. But people were interested, and so they tuned in. Indeed, the death of monarchs remains a potent story, as all the coverage around the passing of Queen Elizabeth just last year indicates very clearly. And NHK was the place to go to get that coverage, making it both popular and cementing its claim to be the voice, so to speak, of the Japanese nation. The popularity of the broadcasts in turn helped convince bureaucrats and others of the value of radio. Clearly, this was a medium that really could shape a political narrative around the country even more so than a newspaper could. The Communication Ministry began to pour money into NHK to expand its reach, with a goal of getting broadcasts into every major city by November 6, 1928, the day of the coronation of the new Showa emperor, otherwise known as Hirohito. In this goal, they were ultimately successful. The hope was that radio coverage would get people invested in the emperor, who after all was the ultimate symbol of the Japanese state. And once again, it worked. People tuned in for the broadcasts surrounding the coronation ceremonies in big numbers. Thus, from its inception, radio was very intertwined with the goals of the imperial state in Japan. It was also popular. People were willing, for example, to pay the high electric bills associated with the device, given the expensive nature of Japanese electricity at the time, probably because radio is much more immediate and can be used for news, entertainment, and other things, where phonographs, which we discussed last week, are a bit more limited. Speaking of other uses, I'd be remiss not to mention one of the other features of early radio, which became in its own way as iconically Japanese as the imperial throne itself: Radio Taiso. If you've never heard of this before, the phrase just means radio exercises. These days, of course, such things have been rendered obsolete by the advent of YouTube workout videos with which we all became so familiar in the heady days of the lockdowns, and honestly, in a lot of ways, Radio Taiso serves a similar function. Basically, these are just simple calisthenic workout routines done following the calls of an announcer, usually with some very earnest and, if I am being honest, very dorky music played alongside. The idea originated in the United States, with the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company of New York, otherwise known as MetLife, taking the lead in broadcasting them from what's now the MetLife Tower in Manhattan, starting in April 1926. It was the MetLife broadcasts which drew the attention of a pair of Communication Ministry bureaucrats, Inokuma Teiji and Shindo Seiichi. Inokuma was dispatched to the US on a research tour in 1923, and was in New York when MetLife employees were first developing this program in 1924. Shindo Seiichi went back 3 years later after the broadcasts had started to see them in action and think about whether NHK should try them as well. His view was that NHK could greatly benefit from adopting this program, and he wrote precisely that in an article for an internal Teishensho publication. That article in turn was apparently pretty convincing because by the next year, NHK was running its own Radio Taiso for the first time. Alongside the enthronement of Hirohito, it was one of the big draws of early radio in Japan. On its face, this whole thing is very innocuous. After all, again, these are just light calisthenics, very simple exercises designed to be doable by anyone to build up a light sweat, even the young, the sickly, or the old. And then there's the music. Really, it's quite goofy. But rather strangely given the content, the program always had a bizarrely social Darwinistic undertone to it. Much of the rationale for Radio Taiso within the Communications Ministry revolved around the idea of building up the physical strength of the Japanese nation for a dog-eat-dog competition against the imperial powers of the West. To win that competition, the thinking was, the people of the nation needed to be healthy and thus encouraged to exercise. Doing dorky variations of the jumping jack in a park was, I suppose, the first step on the road to glorious conquest. There is also something to the idea you see in many a sociology paper that Radio Taiso itself is a bit authoritarian in its form. After all, a literal requirement of the program is to have people move in sync with each other to the command of a single voice. And it certainly is true that there is something to the idea of obedience instilled by rote. Everyone from North Korean soldiers to Zen monks have clued in on the idea that if you make someone do something in sync with others for long enough, they begin to internalize this in a way that pure language can't really match. Which maybe explains why, after World War II, US occupation authorities actually banned Radio Taiso as a militaristic practice that was dangerous to democratic values. I don't know that I fully buy into the idea that the practice itself is inherently authoritarian, which you do see advanced occasionally in academia. This would seem to imply that anyone giving instructions to a group is inherently authoritarian, which might technically be true, but is really conflating two different meanings of the word authoritarian anyway. But that's an unnecessarily philosophical tangent, and an irrelevant one, because as anyone who had to sit through old instructional VHS tapes from Japan can tell you, Rajyo Taiso was brought back by NHK almost immediately after the end of the occupation, albeit with much more of a focus on both personal health benefits of exercise and cringy music. The other area where radio took off was sports broadcasting, the birth, so to speak, of modern sports fandom when it became possible to follow a team even at games you couldn't go to yourself. As a bit of an aside, the very origin of sports broadcasting in Japan is somewhat controversial. If you tried to research this online, you'd probably find someone telling you the first sports broadcast in Japanese history took place on August 13, 1927, from the Hankyu Koshien Stadium in Kobe, home to that year's National Middle School Baseball Championships, broadcast live by the local NHK station, JOBK. But technically, that's not true. The first sports broadcast in the Japanese Empire took place 7 weeks earlier, on June 18, 1927. An NHK substation, JODK, carried a live broadcast of a sumo tournament held in the city of Keijo. And if you've never heard of Keijo, that's because nobody uses that Japanese-style name anymore for the city of Seoul. It's not like people forgot this happened. Some of NHK's own histories mention the broadcast, albeit in footnotes rather than the main text. The omission likely has more to do with embarrassment over the imperial past than anything else. Anyway, sports broadcasting was another area where the potential of radio was immediate and obvious. After all, sports are fundamentally about narrative, the story of the game, the story of the season, a player's career arc, and so on. On the other hand, when you sit down and think about it, there are some pretty important structural hurdles to live play-by-play that have to be cleared before it becomes, well, anything you want to listen to. And here's where we have to take a wonderful foray into the world of the earliest sports radio commentators in Japan. These pioneers did not have an early job. Off the bat, the Communications Ministry actually had regulations in place that gave it wide-ranging censorship power over anything broadcast in Japan. Every script had to be pre-approved. Which was easy enough to do with scripted or pre-recorded shows, but the thing about sports is that they are, well, live. JOBK, the station responsible for the Kobe-based baseball broadcast, had to negotiate a deal where a Communications Ministry bureaucrat was literally standing next to the broadcast, with the authority to pull the plug if anything inappropriate was said. This approach, having a bureaucrat on hand who could cut things off at a whim, was codified into law in 1930. Any live broadcast had to have a monitor on hand. I haven't found too many first-hand accounts of this, or indeed any record of the emergency cutoff actually being used, but one imagines it made for a somewhat tense working relationship. Beyond censorship, there was one other major issue. Live commentary is a skill. It takes a lot of work. If you ever want to see how hard it is, mute a sports game and try explaining what's happening in an interesting way in real time to someone who's not familiar with the sport. Trust me, as someone who has tried to get my friends into ice hockey, it is harder than it looks. And the thing was, there was nobody in Japan with that skill set in 1927 because live commentary didn't exist. Which brings us to the story of Uotani Tadashi, the first recorded sports broadcaster in Japanese history. So far as I know, the commentators for that sumo match in Seoul are unknown. Uotani had grown up playing baseball, but in his day there wasn't really much of a way to go pro after school, and so he went into banking instead, until NHK offered him a gig, looking to potentially build up a stable of baseball commentators for its new venture into radio. Still, the whole thing came together at the last minute. Uotani didn't even know he was slated to cover the game until a few weeks in advance, and had to practice by going to the earlier elimination rounds and doing fake play-by-play to get comfortable with the process. He also picked the brain of an Asahi Shimbun reporter who had just come back from the US and listened to radio commentary of Major League Baseball games there. So how'd it go? Well, the broadcast itself was not recorded, but a listener transcribed it in shorthand and submitted the transcription to the Asahi Shimbun, and it is, frankly, not good. Uotani's commentary essentially focused on two things: shouting "Sora," essentially "look over here," whenever the ball was hit, and describing the direction in which the ball went when it was hit. Not exactly scintillating stuff. Still, again, it wasn't like there was much competition at this point. For example, 10 days after the game he broadcast, Tokyo-based JOAK carried a match at Meiji Jingu Stadium between the first and third higher schools. To cover the match, JOAK selected Matsuuchi Norizo, a financial news announcer with no knowledge of baseball. Which was fine, because alongside him would be the Meiji period novelist Kume Masao, a self-professed die-hard baseball fan who would write ideas for things Matsuuchi could say, using his combined baseball and fancy literary knowledge. As you might imagine, if you think about this for longer than literally 1 second, the whole thing was a complete train wreck. For starters, baseball is not the fastest sport, but when things happen, they happen quick. Far quicker than even the best writer can come up with material for on the fly. And Kume apparently wasn't much help at all anyway, because he was a fan of the first higher school and they lost very badly. Supposedly he was so distraught that he was basically silent and unmoving the whole game. JOAK broke up the duo after only one game, and the whole debacle set off a fiery debate in the sports section of local papers, with various listeners, including the novelist and playwright Kikuchi Kan, who was pretty famous himself in the literary world and I guess didn't like Kume that much, essentially accusing Matsuuchi of being a hack and Kume of being a fake baseball fan. Apparently he misused the phrase doubleheader during the broadcast. Kume, embarrassed by the whole thing, would leave baseball behind for a moderately successful literary career until his death in 1952. Matsuuchi Norizo, however, would actually stick with it and become something of a famous tastemaker for his play-by-play style. Interestingly, that's because he had a good eye for narrative. His broadcasts would often lag a bit behind the action of the game, but he'd spend a lot of time on the psychology of, say, a pitching duel between a pitcher and a batter, or the shifts outfielders were making to account for the way a certain batter liked to hit. Basically, he made a story out of what was happening, and this was so popular he actually had a side gig re-recording his commentary for record players a day or two after a game, since live recording was not really possible given the sound quality of the time. Lest you think I am exaggerating his influence, the contemporary magazine Baseboru literally described Matsuuchi as, quote, the baseball world's benefactor, one who has popularized the game across Japan. Of course, sports is more than just baseball, and in the 30s, two other big sporting events captured the public imagination: the 1932 Olympics, held in Los Angeles, and the 1936 ones, held in Berlin. NHK by this point was a bit more experienced with live broadcasting and had commentary teams on hand for both events, though they had to revamp their 32 plans in the middle of the action. Originally, NHK had a deal with the American company NBC to use their studios for live broadcasts back to Japan, but then the International Olympic Committee, in its infinite wisdom, decided to ban live broadcasts of the Olympics for fear that this would cut into ticket sales. Just remember, everyone, the IOC is a very legitimate institution, which is definitely not just in it for the money. So instead, NHK reporters had to jot down notes and then run to the local NBC affiliate and record a fake version of the live broadcast to send back to Japan. Despite this rather slapdash approach, people tuned in. Partially this was driven by the growing adoption of radio itself. Those holdouts who had not bought one for the occasion of Hirohito's coronation often had during the Manchurian incident in 1931, trying to follow the fast pace of events around the army's illegal invasion of northeastern China. Partially, of course, people also tuned into the Olympics because they are a national competition, and nationalist feeling, stoked by war propaganda, was at a high pitch. For example, here are the broadcast notes taken by the broadcaster Shimaura Seiji after Japan swept all medals in the 100-meter backstroke. Quote, First place Japan, second place Japan, third place Japan. The day Japan has long yearned for has finally arrived. Now, thanks to our three heroes, we can feel overwhelming pride at the sight of three Japanese flags fluttering high as the Kimi ga Yo anthem plays in the background. Let us join in our friends' cheer, for now Japan has conquered the entire world. In retrospect, given future events, that last line may not have been the best call. 1936 was equally a little messy in how it came together. The three-man broadcasting team sent to Berlin almost missed one of the most hotly anticipated moments of the whole competition, the women's 200-meter breaststroke. Mai Hata Hideko, one of Japan's best swimmers, had narrowly missed out on becoming the first Japanese woman to win a gold medal at the 1932 Olympics. She lost to the Australian Claire Dennis by 0.1 seconds. Ever since, she had been training obsessively, and there was a lot of excitement around her squaring off against Germany's Martha Denninger for a shot at the gold. NHK almost missed the broadcast, first because their transmitter broke down and they had to go get a new one. Since the new transmitter was attuned to a different frequency, they then had to telegraph the new frequency back to Tokyo with about 2 hours to spare. Then, the broadcast itself was almost cut out because of time zone issues. The race was set for 3:40 p.m. Berlin time, but had to be delayed until 4, which coincidentally is midnight in Japan, when the Communication Ministry had a mandatory broadcast cutoff so people would not spend all night glued to their radios. If you look at the opening of the transmission, announcer Kasai Sansei starts by saying, quote, "Please don't turn off the switch, it's already time, but just wait." You might think, just looking at it, he's asking for tired listeners not to switch off their radios because of how late it is in Japan. He's actually pleading with the ministry not to cut off the transmission for violating Japanese law, which, in the end, they did not. The rest of the transcript is, frankly, not scintillating. Within the final few seconds of the race, Kasai repeats some variation of Mai Hata Gambare, or Go Mai Hata, 16 times. When she finally edges out her victory, he repeats some variation of Mai Hata wins 19 consecutive times. So clearly a very exciting moment, not what I would call incisive sports commentary. But then again, that's not really the point, is it? Or the reason people listen to sports broadcasts. If you want to take your time and analyze things, the box scores in the paper, or these days a YouTube highlight reel or film breakdown, is probably better. Live broadcasting is all about, well, being live, the immediacy of being there in a certain sense, and watching the narrative of the game unfold through the eyes of a skilled observer. That's the draw, in the end. The other big broadcast items for the early years of NHK, however, were not as immediate. Back in 1925, when Tokyo's JOAK station was in its infancy, the station ordered a poll of listeners to get a sense of what they wanted to hear. NHK followed up with a nationwide poll 7 years later. The results of the two are pretty consistent and very interesting to compare. The 1925 survey gets very granular in terms of performance genre. By my count, there were 29 different options, from traditional Japanese fare to jazz. The 1932 one is a bit less granular, with fewer options. However, one of the top performers on both was Naniwabushi. Now, we actually talked about Naniwabushi last week because it was also a driver of phonograph sales. The genre is often compared to blues or jazz. There are two performers, a singer who tells a story melodically while partially improvising, and a shamisen player who keeps time and interjects every so often with little snippets of their own. The stories told are often melodramatic. For example, the tale of the revenge of the 47 Ronin was a popular choice, with all its wistful discussions of duty, honor, and the demands thereof. Also, a heaping helping of gory violence to keep things exciting. Naniwabushi had actually fallen off somewhat in popularity from the 1910s when it was one of the early drivers of the popularity of the phonograph. Competition from movies in particular had cut into its market presence, so to speak. But the 1930s was a period of revival for the genre, driven by the increasing militarism of the era. The gory melodrama of Naniwabushi played well in an increasingly nationalistic atmosphere where official propaganda stressed honor and sacrifice for the nation. Nani Wabushi would continue to dominate the airwaves, especially constant tellings and retellings of the 47 Ronin, until 1945. The other dominant medium, requested in both the 25 and 32 surveys, was radio drama. And this is a pretty fascinating form because, podcast revivals notwithstanding, thanks to the advent of television, it emerged, became very popular, and then basically died in the span of just a few decades. The first such dramas were broadcast in Tokyo in 1925. What exactly you'd call the first radio drama is a subject of some intense debate around definitions, because it matters whether or not the drama had to be made for radio in the first place or was adapted or something else. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that NHK leadership quickly decided it was lucrative and worth going all in on. In its infancy, NHK had a hard time retaining subscribers, which was the only way the service turned a profit because it didn't allow advertising, as its leadership was trying to figure out what people wanted to listen to in the first place. Radio plays were a huge potential moneymaker. The second head of NHK, Yabe Kenjiro, developed a program that commissioned famous writers to produce plays for 500 yen each, a pretty enticing fee, enough to buy a small house, which would peel off some big names from publishing contracts. More importantly for NHK, the big-name writers had star power that served as advertising, and outside of the scripts, production was pretty cheap. Just voice actors you could basically grab off the street, and some very basic sound effects, using sound designers who'd mostly cut their chops on the world of the stage before coming over to radio. Very few of these early plays unfortunately withstand the test of time. The few that were genuinely popular have been adapted to other media in the subsequent decades, but most existed as a kind of broadcast filler, the 20s and 30s equivalent of the generic studio sitcom. In point of fact, the most lasting legacy of the radio play was creating the infrastructure in NHK that television writers would be able to take advantage of starting in the 50s. Writers' rooms, sound designers, experienced producers used to working on tight schedules, that sort of thing. For both radio drama and Nani Wabushi, the draw of the genre, like sports in a lot of ways, was the sense of immediacy, of being immersed in a performance or a story. And you can see how the novelty of that would be exciting and how the advent of TV would supersede and sweep it away as time went on. Indeed, it's interesting as symbolism that radio inaugurated the transition from pre- to post-war Japan in a very literal way, because it was of course on the radio that the people of Japan heard directly from their emperor for the very first time, though sound quality issues combined with archaic courtly speech meant many could not understand what was being said. It was pretty clear from context, of course, on August 15, 1945, that the emperor was announcing Japan's defeat and surrender in World War II. There, too, radio provided a sense of immediacy. That was part of the power of using the emperor's voice, of course, so there could be no question of the legitimacy of the decision, since he was telling you himself. Radio didn't disappear after World War II, of course, it hasn't here either, and the fact that you're listening to a podcast right now suggests some lingering interest in the audio medium. But particularly once Japan's economic miracle really got going in the 60s and standards of living began to dramatically improve, the cultural writing was on the wall. Today, in point of fact, I'd argue more folks are familiar with NHK as a TV network than a radio one. The heyday of Japanese radio and global radio came to an end, one more victim of the technological cycle of progress. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. You can also find places on both of those websites to reach out to me with questions for our 500th episode, which is coming up and will be, as always, a question and answer episode. Special thanks to those who have given on Patreon at the shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Cat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for a somewhat different episode as we talk a little bit about travel in Japan.